Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman legions, hyper debated topic, or at least, an easily discussable one. One gets, let's say, the essentials of it, can make a video quite easily on. As you know, we have discussed Roman warfare extensively in Schwerpunkts history. I think in 1500 videos we have uh, more than 100 dedicated to Roman warfare. And of course, every time I have to talk about this, I don't have a blank paper crisis, as you understand, because albeit I'm just a medievalist, I had actually an extensive interest in ancient warfare during my life, but also before I went to university back in the day, where I studied mostly, in fact, medieval warfare. And as you have realized from the recent, in fact, mini-series that this video is also part of for the holidays, there is all a dimension of Roman warfare that, again, in spite of the large amount of videos you can find on the topic on YouTube, is still not properly addressed. And part of the reason is methodological. In practice, it's really that you don't have experts discussing this stuff, but very often, not even among them, people that really care about the essence rather than the detail. Right? As I was saying before, just as you know, I don't watch other channels' content, but it's really easy. And an experiment you can do, just search on YouTube like Roman legions or Roman warfare. Why, I don't know, the Romans were so, say, strong, successful, whatever, and you'll have this prototype of 9 minutes video, essentially saying, okay, well, you have the chance of saying that right in 9 minutes, right, as opposed to my videos that are like 3 hours long. And if you really make a great synthesis and you can properly get the point precisely, etc., I give you 9 minutes to say that, and most of this content goes like, once upon a time there was Rome, and initially Rome was a monarchy, and then they passed to consul. They start saying things that, without any context, without any in-depth look at the thing, just as a gross over or simplification, and things that are properly not even political or strategic culture at all. They're just like a list, right? A supermarket list of stuff that you can gather here and there, putting that together, gluing that with a spit, and saying, okay, this is the 9 minutes presentation on why, say, the Roman military was the one it was. As you have understood in my videos, I make mostly a point that has, say, the root cause of this capital in success in a worldview, fundamentally, and in the attitude that Roman culture had in general towards the rest of the peoples, and fundamentally what role they thought they had in the universe, in a religious sense, etc. So I will try not to digress here, because we're talking about legions, things should get a bit more technical, right? Even though, as we will see now, even trying to segment too much, because that's become fashionable as well. I mean, okay, there was this first leader passing the various reforms of the Roman army from the Servian to, say, the Livian, the Polybian, even though some of these were not reforms technically, but the various phases, and saying at this point the army was like this, point was like that. And again, it would be just a list of, how many legionnaires were there in a Polybian legion, 3,600, how many in a Marian one, 4,800, and what was and making these differences as categorical, as structural, as deterministic, as material, and as fundamentally abstract as they can be, right? Structural history does not exist, right? Even though there are kind of channels out there that need to make you see pictures about, look at the scheme here, how the legion is organized, you will understand the true core of how this worked. And they don't even address the most obvious realization for anyone who has gotten just a little bit beyond the surface in Roman history and warfare, that nobody actually knows how the Roman legions fought, right? When we look at these armies that the legions, of course, are, we try essentially to make of them a sort of special technical alien in say in the ancient world, and pretending that just the way the organic was structured, or say what kind of equipment that the troops had, was such a deeply deterministically decisively differentiating aspect that would bring the sure success of these legions, and because they were just in this deep core of, again, of numbers, of shapes, or whatever. This is not the way, as you know, I'm habituated to make military history. I'm also properly not habituated to make any form of relativism, because I think that when you have to explain the causes of a phenomenon, you can't really make a lot of... It was a mix of vague factors, and yes, these were superior, but I don't really know why they were superior, and we were just guessing about maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And I think I will not repeat myself as far as these questions are concerned, because I already made videos telling the truth about, for example, Roman archaic warfare, like how, for example, the Roman military came to be the one we appreciate the most from this, in fact, Latin city-state, for not saying kind of feudal tribal action community at the same time, into that was lorded over by, for example, Alba Longa, and another Latin power in archaic times. So that there is actually a lot to dig in that old past, aside from the older historiographers such as Fabius Pictor and so on, because even there you have properly to explain what happened and how, in which timeline. For example, the Servian legion, as we intended according to Roman traditional historiography, is basically the democratic system that starts appearing, as far as we understand, actually, as most, what Roman statal things are concerned, in the 4th century BC, right? It has to do with a transition phase rather than a specific reform. Sure, it was initiated, but there were lots of back and forth and so on. So it's just at the end of the 4th century that we start appreciating, say, the Livian legion, but we call like this because it's described specifically in Livy, organized in a certain way. Then by the 3rd century, especially about the Second Punic War, and or what we can appreciate slightly earlier by the first, the so-called Polybian legion had certain characteristics. And then, telling the truth, yes, we have important sources that describe Roman warfare in detail, especially Caesar's Commentari and so on. But even for early imperial times, we don't really have an enormous amount of information about Roman legions, and that was the heyday of the Roman Empire, and the, say, also the one, of course, of its military, given that it was the most efficient branch of the Roman state. And as we've seen, Rome had taken over the known war by that point. So, in a way, in perspective, that already gives you the scale of how approximate our understanding about Roman warfare really is. For example, the 2nd century BC, which was a crucial time to actually define the changes that eventually were fundamentally formalized by the Marian reforms, because they were already there, right? Arguably since the Second Punic War, even including the cohort and some level fundamental of uniformity in equipment, for reasons that are known now, but took place also in a critical phase of Roman history. And I made videos about the late Roman army that today we do not discuss, because this miniseries is mostly about the stereotypical early imperial phase. But as you know, I have actually a very positive opinion of the late Roman army, which gets constantly misunderstood, right? It's not an overassessment or a kind of contrarian, stubborn point to say that the the Constantinian army, so we're talking essentially about the full 4th century until the last decades, was tactically wise the single most successful Roman army that ever existed, as it coped with much more powerful foes, from the Alemannic Confederacy to the Sasanian Empire, that Rome had ever met. Right? And there is all a history, in fact, of the Roman legion in this sense that should be properly appreciated, looking at also the various enemies that Rome coped with. And you know that I took my time to explain this at different points. Again, you know, there is the playlist there about Roman warfare. You can find everything. But I like to also make this more general videos, because not just for the sake of theory and kind of also putting all together and clarifying certain general aspects that, again, are important, but in order exactly to explain better also what the more in-depth, in detailed videos are really meant to be, right? Last year, for example, I made a video about the cohortal system and explaining, fundamentally, for example, the Manipular Legion is it gets perhaps more misunderstood than the others, but at least has the genesis of it has been successfully explained, and it's just, you know, the lag between popular understanding and generally speaking what are in fact the historiographical assessment that that causes the problem. And there would be actually a lot to tell about that too, because essentially the genesis of the Manipular Legion also is lost in the same birth of the 4th century Roman army proper, that before that was essentially the sum of feudal clanic retinues. Doesn't matter how large or ready and already provided with a dramatic combativeness, but surely not so effective as the Manipular Legion. It also was a pretty actually unwieldy thing compared to what is commonly believed, until the Second Punic War was really the big step forward in Roman history, and consequently also military development, that opened to professionalism, to the all year long warfare, etc. And so for not talking just about the external influences in a way. So I actually plan to talk a lot about these topics because they are very easy to misunderstand. Just the simplest cliches. The Romans copied the classical political system from the Hellenic world. It never happened historically. Right? It's not that happened something that went close to that. It literally never happened. There are even and regarding the cohortal system I was referring to also, like at some point cohorts appeared. Why? I don't know, because say maybe they had this is the general answer given, because they were formations that could hold better, say the Cimbrian infantry charges, or how that does that answer the fact that at the same time the Romans were fighting in Numidia against essentially light cavalry skirmishes. Doesn't make any sense. It's actually a much more political and strategic issue that has also to do especially with the role of occupation forces, which is often overlooked, and we will partly address today. And then there are all the various fantasies related to early imperial warfare. There's still kind of a bit of categorism, dogmatism. The legionnaires were equipped like this, and the auxiliaries were equipped like that, or these legions were somehow kind of all alike, and they never changed, or they had a special tactics. It was the way it was. They combined the sword with the javelin that made it all, or this or that, or eventually the most abstract BS like the Romans had greater numerical superiority. Where actually, or it was all about logistics, or it was all about technology, right? So here we are completely taking off from reality and saying goodbye to all things, because again, it's easier to I understand that, especially if you're not into the thing historically, it's easier to be content with saying, okay, it was this factor, and I'll sleep tonight because of that, so I will feel more accomplished. But unfortunately, that's not really what historians do, nor what really happened in reality. So again, you can't say out of that, but it's somehow not prudent at least to go out there and expecting, those who got a bit more interested in the issue to be, say, positively responsive towards that, let's say. And let's admit it, I think as we are, as I understand, mostly millennial males, we all got the hardcore, Facebook history group, Roman legion debate argument with people that we would like to assassinate as a consequence. It happens. It's part of the way, of course, we grow up, because there is a specific phase in somebody's learning and growth that has to do with that confrontation, without which you can't not literally develop the critical skill, or in fact improving your own knowledge, your own understanding. So presenting a topic like this one today is very embarrassing to me, because I could speak literally for 10 hours in a row. I would just run out of voice first, but at that point I would have not even begun to make a satisfying premise to this all. So in part, you will find already something said in the videos I made, but I promise that, given I see, by the way, that this late Roman history videos get a lot of views now, which I thought most people were just in migration era topics and etc. Instead, the average has leveled there, and I made this Roman history videos, and the views boomed for some reason. And I get the importance of the generic cut of them that can pave the way for something more consistent and orderly about these broader topics in general. Because, again, most of the videos made are very in-depth, like, let's study this aspect of the equipment, or the organic, or the single phase in Roman history. Then there are these hyper-generic videos in which I explain, say, can we make, I'm answering the question factually, can we make a broader statement about what was kind of a Roman legion about, approximately, and what did it make it different from the rest of the armies at the time. And there is an in-between, kind of more systematic, partly structural, in the sense that we analyze, say, era by era, in that kind of approximate way, but assessing properly what was, say, the archaic feudal army of Rome, or what was in fact the manipular legion, why was it born, etc. These are all questions that tickle me enormously, because, again, I could talk forever, and I realize that I can exploit it for the benefit not just of the audience, but of everyone of the channel, and so on. So I will be getting in this stuff. And today's video is somehow disappointing in the single details, but I hope that I can assess some major aspects of, say, even how in the way one should approach Roman history or warfare. First of all, I think it's fair to speak, even though it sounds a bit like a cliche, but I'll try to make it clearer and more concrete now, because very often the terms are thrown around, but not really substantiated, as we were explaining before, that the Roman legions were essentially flexible and specialized units, right? Today, again, we concentrate mostly on early imperial legions, but as I was saying before, there was not a radical difference, at least properly in the imperial expansion of Rome, since the last centuries BC, and for some centuries later. So there are some important passages, but we will explain what is this flexibility and specialization about. because most people get, first of all, flexibility, mostly a matter of literally a plastic material, dynamic thing, especially in a tactical sense, right? The Roman legion was flexible, meaning what? It could move better on the field compared to other armies. I made a video, by the way, about the comparison between the Manipular legion and the Macedonian phalanx, which is the top topic. People can slaughter each other just like the Romans with their gladi at the Battle of Pydna, chopping heads and limbs, and that's kind of also a matter of deep kind of historiographical insight, because even venturing in classical warfare without, for example, knowing ancient Greek or Latin is quite problematic, to say the least, because certain words have a very specific semantics that some translators, even, just to make an example, Connolly, famously enough, used Loeb translator, and he transformed the Libo-Phoenician longue-quai, that was fundamentally a heavy javelin, that was used also by other, which is, the term is Greek, bear in mind, so we find this also for Hellenistic marines, for other type of, even for horsemen and so on, and he translated it as pike, because he just followed a translator, so showing, it's not much that, but it shows that he had never posed himself the problem of looking banally at the context of the term longue-quai in Hellenic sources during mostly Hellenistic times and warfare, and understanding that had nothing to do with pike. So as a consequence, you find from Connolly's books, the internet filled with pictures of Carthaginian infantrymen equipped with Macedonian pikes, and thus also the complete fantasy delusion that the Carthaginians ever adopted any kind, or any other people that were not, in fact, the Greeks adopted the Hellenistic pikeman phalanx of some sort, and already this means that if you have gotten, here, of course, talking badly about specific scholars, but just to make you understand that very often you're not better than a scholar. But if they make that mistake, you can imagine what people's imagination which turns it can take, simply. So it's that dramatic. And so all the weirdest explanation of why, on the field, of course you understand that the way that the problem is approached is from Rome Total War, right? Video game, first hand, purely tactical and narrow, mechanistic, deterministic, positivistic perspective, right? It has to work like that because I saw it in the game, right? Or I saw it because somebody else had said it, or Mike Housen thought it was the case, or whatever. Forums are the most terrifying places you can. Actually, they're a gold mine. I could probably make billions of views if I just started to comment on all the garbage that you find on forums publicly. But those also died, so it would be mostly some kind of necrophilus interest. Another aspect that is considered less in a way. So you say, Roman legions were more flexible, right? So they had to win. That's the point, the Romans had found a way to use legions like gummy balls that it could jump and being squeezed and move and whatever, and so all the others were stupid, and that's actually only how the Romans won, because also the others had good ideas, but their armies were not flexible enough, man, right? So that's the problem. All right, and then there is the other aspect which is kind of more interesting and underappreciated, is to say the concept of specialization, right? The fact that the Roman legions, albeit having an impressive amount of uniformity for, in fact, ancient warfare standards, and not even dramatically distant, telling the truth, but still, for the times being, meaning how and why that was achieved, even in terms that can appear to us rather relative, could in fact adapt dramatically to a lot of operational strategical, tactical, environmental situations, also to especially to the various enemies that at the end of the day that's what the armed forces mainly do, right? Nothing is so important in warfare as the enemy that you're fighting, in the way you are fighting at the end of the day. Not even the weather, not even the terrain per se really is. It is, at least in the measure in which the enemy copes with it at the same time. And that's an underappreciated aspect of it all, just because also we tend to focus on just the legionnaires per se, and again as sort of wargamistic units, troops, and then we look at equipment, etc., but we don't realize what at that level of organic, actual, larger unit tactical employment, etc., what or strategic one for that matter, and at the end of the day, the political and social essence of these armies, what we're really about, because that takes too much time, and again, the average person is too lazy to take that in consideration, except, that is directly proportional to the degree of things that you should be knowing that make a difference. So, not being particularly beneficial to your analysis at that point. It is true, though, that no infantry of antiquity, by the degree that we're going to explain now, resembled the Roman legion. We're talking mainly about infantry here, because in ancient times, unless we're talking about nomadic peoples, or particularly feudal ones, which are some kind of the exception, infantry was by far the decisive arm, right? And even in this sense, there is no such thing like a single Roman infantry culture just per se, depending on how much you stretch the chronological line. There are different times in which, for example, equestrian culture was very important, especially in archaic Rome. Actually, horsemen were quite strong, and that's something that we have decided to forget, even there for issues that do not even take in consideration just literally the difference conceptually between absolute and relative. The reason, for example, people like to say, also because there is this sort of pro-Celtic bias in a sort of revenge sense, right? The Celts. I appreciate the Celts made many videos about their warfare, and they should be studied more and better because they're really interesting. But even I know that there is a lot of hype towards kind of the Vikings, the Norse, the Germans. There's a lot of kind of ethno-nationalism behind these things. But let's say the way the Celtic legacy is weaponized to, especially try to destroy, literally iconoclastically, the quality of the Roman military by making the most disgusting type of historical and scientific relativism that you can find, I think, around this kind of internet subcultures, forums, etc. for, again, sort of resentment. I've never seen, right? It's full of idiots of every people. This applies also for the Romans, for anyone that have to say, no, my people was better because it makes me feel better because I'm actually I'm an underachiever, and so that will hopefully make me think I belong to something that in some way I can use as a flag and fool other morons like me that I'm somehow of any quality, right? This is beyond, because very often you meet that kind of person that is exposed to a certain amount of information, like the internet allows you to do, but in a completely shapeless way. And so basically you can select all the things you like to all the pros, for example, and say separating it from all the cons and pretending that only the pros exist. And especially not to realize that if you don't even count the cons, you can't properly even dimension or contextualizing them or making a point through them. And one of the reasons why people think that the Romans had a weak cavalry is, first of all, the fact, of course, that the Roman legions were mostly infantry. So, like basically all peoples in sedentary Europe, they had simply more infantry than cavalry. But the other reason that gets in that kind of comparative way is that when the Romans fought against the Celts had numerically, by actually few in the broader picture, because still Celtic armies were overwhelmingly infantry based, but still they had numerically, say, even if it's just here, no structuralism can be made. Let's say even if they had a 1.5 advantage numerically, that still is important, right, from a military point of view. And so people tend to make this equation, say if they had more cavalry, it means that their cavalry was stronger. What does it mean, right? In absolute terms, mean that they had more. So yes, they had more force put in cavalry, but what was this cavalry really about, and how qualitative was it? And telling the truth, even though the Romans, first of all, crushed essentially Celtic Europe in spite of this, and very often also thanks to their own cavalry, and there are many instances also of not just of this collectively, but also challenges in single combat, whatever. This actually doesn't mean at all that, for example, the Celtic military system had any superior quality in cavalry, right? The fact that, say, the Gallic nobility was obsessed with horses, this was actually true for lots of other peoples, right? Nobody stresses that for, say, the Celtiberians or the Carthaginians, right? It must be, even though it's actually even famous, the same is true in part for the same Greeks, right? There is, again, yet another bias here, that is the republicanistic, democraticistic one, the idea that we are obviously rediscovering that cavalry was actually very important among the sedentary Europeans and beyond, as we've seen even the Carthaginians, etc., and that this was normal at the time, and that we were fooled by this kind of citizens soldiery, civic democratic ideal for which just infantry was there and was important. This is not true, right? The Romans literally rewarded their knights as basically, even against the true concept of citizen soldiery, the one, for example, for which the average Miles had to provide for his own equipment, the knights were provided with extra resources by the state, right? So they were actually a privileged class, as you know, and in general, Roman historiography created the myth of some others people's relative superiority that has been interpreted like, this was an absolute one of some sort due to some intrinsic hardcore quality that is not really to be found. I mean, if the enemy had double cavalry than you in a single battle, of course the historian is saying, damn, this man had more cavalry than us, so that cavalry was dangerous. Hence, the contemporary reader says, oh my god, that people had such a strong cavalry, or that's not how it really worked. And most of the times, not realizing that if at the end of the day that people lost, and repeatedly, and without, in this case, even properly being wiped out as a sort of ethnic entity, the question is, that arm was part of an integrated, combined arms system. The question is, why wouldn't that make the difference at the end of the day? And very often, again, there is this thing, no, they were all equal, or they had all the same, or it's a trick, it's a perspective. I want to increase the strength of this one and diminishing the one of this other, so that I can flip the thing, can mix cards, and pretending that for some strange accident of fate, this people conquered this other one. And it's all a conspiracy of the winner that wrote history over these people, as if, by the way, all the rest properly of history, all the other people's watching, or the archaeology didn't tell us that it's literally what happened with an incredible degree of accuracy, and that there is also on the base of a general comparative diachronic understanding of a military history, no match. It's a non-problem, right? And so, but people have conspiratorial problems, and very often the measure of their military incompetence is exactly revolving around, for example, a single arm or a single type of weaponry, or saying arbitrary things like, again, I don't know, the Romans could field more legions than, say, than these other people, because they had the thing of the citizenship. How did they convince the world to be conquered, to participate in Roman citizenry, also from a military point of view, starting from literally a city in front of the wall, Europe with tens of millions of people, and kind of, making it anyway. Like, these are things that probably do not even begin to want to picture any historical evidence in an objective or self-evident way. But unfortunately, at least we are witnessing a real, and this is now from a good half century, decay of neurocognitive capacities in the population, and we have to explain this for them. Like what was self-evident or obvious before, now we have to explain for, and not just for to children, but to adults that, of course, as children were properly not educated, nor by their parents, nor by their educational systems, but that are real adults living in the real world and doing things, and then you kind of don't have to wonder why we do spot the IQs are going down and all this thing. But again, as you can flip easily these things in today's world, you can't measure exactly why it's so easy to fool people in the same way. So the difference between, say, a Roman legion and another army of antiquity stood in characteristics that actually were present pretty much everywhere, were somehow universal, right? But that still were employed by a scale, by a quantity and a quality that made the Roman legionnaire essentially a simple yet extraordinarily powerful infantryman, especially in his own unit, but also, and this is also dramatically forgotten, as a single fighter. I realized that we should get also a bit in combat history, because people got interested since Keegan's phase of battle that is actually a pretty trashy work, and this kind of, oh my god, it kind of almost movie, first person video game approach. Oh my god, how it is that, which is, by the way, literally the least important thing on a political and strategic scale, right? It's important in, realizing that, of course, warfare is that, because we are the ones who got somehow more distant from the fact that that's the reality of war. But, if, of course, nobody ever explained you what war is, you may be amazed by the brutality of warfare, what this means in a first, person experience, by the way. But the first person experience, unless we're talking about the highest command, is one of the single most worthless things in warfare. That is, even a soldier, as a private experience, whatever, may be even throughout all the wars that he wants, but he just not ever been in positions of command, or doesn't properly study warfare, doctrine, military theory, military history. He doesn't quite get really what war is, right? He will suffer physically, he will learn how to kill other people, will test that, will understand, of course, the most important thing, that is the moral dimension of warfare, but not in a way that will make him aware of how to have that war, right? And that's the reason why there is a hierarchy. That's why we organize the military in the way it does. That's why also soldiers just have to brutally obey the discipline. Can be provided it must be provided with a degree of autonomy, for which there is kind of a management dimension of kind of the situation on a smaller scale, but that scale is very often hyperinflatedly portrayed. Look at all the Netflix stuff, right? It's always the this timid guy that could be, again, the average incel that has just played Call of Duty, that is brought to the reality of war, and then it says, and it says all the most by the way, scenographic, improbable, unlikely, display of brutality in an incredible set of coincidences, and then the movie's like, oh my god, war is so brutal. Look at this kid that is so timid. It will learn how to kill another person, and that it ends, right? That those shows are designed basically, again, from the average fourth estater who just basically has not even ever began to understand what warfare is, that in a series like that can basically get all the things he can understand, that is practically nothing about the nature of command and of strategy and the actual moral forces involved on a collective scale. And so the word goes on by saying, oh my god, war is terrible, and they don't even know what it is in a political, in a civic sense, right? So that's why it's particularly important to awaken the awareness of a direct collective responsibility for every single thing that happens, war included, and not keeping to sell this kind of further delusional, paranoid, safe space obsessed lie that is the true only lie of war. That is to say that you are not responsible personally for it, even if you are from the other side of the globe and just remain sit on your chair. And so anti-war movies are really the worst, because they shift completely the balance from, say, who did what and was that right or wrong, to war is bad, let's hope it doesn't ever happen to us, right? And this is exactly how empires fall, because people basically become some sort of maggots that are walked over by anyone who just banally knows how to use brutal violence, but find some properly demilitarized defenseless slob that will basically surrender to anything. And this is exactly what is happening to us. Of course, the ancient world was an environment where people were much more directly aware of the implications of first of all, of that responsibility, but of the implications of warfare. That's what it took to fix that, right? Collectively, politically. That's the same reason why the Romans encircle those stories about, for example, the terrible Gaul with red hair, a giant, a barbarian, incarnating the titan of the European mythologies, that is big but old and terrible, but is also dumb, and so the Uranic Apollonian Roman hero crashes him, and the Gaul, and becomes the thing. But the reality of warfare was very different, because in part, of course, the Romans didn't create fairy tales, because this was all history by a certain degree, and enemies were really threatening. The metus hostilis, as you know, is one of the single most important concepts in Roman politics and history. And if you want guarantee of success for the same idea of Rome, that was essentially a military one, as in the universal imperial belief of the time, but that had, in fact, achieved this degree of unity and of awareness and of responsibility that could crush those other, say, more unbalanced systems that hadn't topped that, what von Clausewitz would speak of the triad, right? So this perfect mix, especially in an aggressive sense. Bear this in mind, that von Clausewitz says that the attack is the offensive is the field in which the Trinity is topped in all its elements, right? So primordial enmity, right? Taste for gamble, right? And rationale, right? Intelligence, understanding. And the mix between this in the perfect balance makes essentially an unstoppable military machine. And this is true from all what we can recognize historically, anthropologically, biologically, psychologically, and Roman culture displays an atrociously developed awareness of this belief that was essentially what Roman faith, right, was based on, just as the one originally of all those peoples that had topped those ideals, and that somehow the Romans reinstated in their establishment, essentially the one that followed from the fall of kings, and from the moment in which the nobility took the reins of the people that had enlarged importantly in the so-called Etruscan phase, and began to send it to their redemption by brutally framing him in this military machine that began to steamroll essentially any neighbor for centuries in a row, with setbacks, with important defeats. The goal, think about the same sack of Rome, the attempted one of assault at the citadel of Capitol Hill, the greatest Roman defeat. Think about Hannibal. Think about also the ones that spread fear, at least propagandistically. For example, the fear of the Cimbrians and the Teutons was a great part of Marian propaganda, because it had to get from the Senate the means, right, that were becoming quite dangerous, especially after the reform that brought basically everybody who wanted to join the army in spite of their lack of any holding property, as they were proletarians, and this kind of concept living on. It's also funny when people say, they read Caesar and say, this is just Caesar's propaganda, but the Gauls that are depicted better, and Tacitus about the Germans too. Any person who actually has read these sources knows perfectly well from Latin literature that these authors were actually flattering these peoples. Actually, Caesar had a positive view of the Gauls. At least it's the one that wanted to present to make the Roman world accepting the extension of Roman citizenship in this Romanized, or yet to be Romanized, Celtic lands. Tacitus was part of those senators that didn't want, in fact, to extend further instead the boundaries in Germany by saying, these are essentially just a bunch of barbarians, yes, living in a wasteland, but they have the true spirits that today we don't have anymore. So just criticizing the imperial leadership and highlighting the spirits of the Germans. If one doesn't even know those things, and doesn't even banally know the difference between the literary element, that is definitely also a positive one, right? Every person should wake up in the morning and thanking God for having made Caesar's works and Tacitus ones exist, right? If they have any interest whatsoever, not just in Rome, but also in the Celts and in the Germans, because without that, you I don't know, you would have probably sold your mother to know any of what they wrote, and instead you spit on it. But aside from the radical underschooling of people that can't even understand the basic meaning of this, universally famous Latin works, the attitude is what disturbs here. Is again, you don't understand anything, literally, about the history, about the peoples, about the literature, about the meaning, the content, whatever. But you must feel paranoid about someone having told you history in a different way. That today, with the historiographical means at our disposal, everybody knows. There's never been another version of Caesar's, conquest of Gaul that was available, in the sense that it's just a dark hole for which, as I was saying before, archaeology doesn't tell us anything, or there is another history that occurred. I don't know how to tell you that. Even if it had been kind of fictionalized in some aspects, it's a dramatically accurate picture of what happened in 1st century BC Gaul at the time of the Roman invasion. And just realize that these works were read by not just there is, especially in Caesar's literature, an important, let's say, food for thought also for the more popular classes, but in general, these were topics that people were informed about. Like, you couldn't write something that was completely different from reality, even when it was evidently kind of a story, in part, without knowing, I don't know, the essence of the Battle of Gergovia or the Battle of Alesia. Right? Those are not invented stories. We rely on Caesar's accounts, but there is no reason in terms of sheer plausibility to doubt that those were at the core the events that actually happened, because it turns out, and this is also the reason why we don't have an adequate strategic culture, and we see the consequences of the same, is that comparatively in history, we do know that peoples that were at that stage of development and that were in that kind of broader political, social, military situation essentially behaved like that, right? If you don't study military history in a comprehensive fashion, you will never even be able to objectivize historical reality alone, and so you will always, first of all, admit that you fundamentally do not understand history, but that you need to recur to fantasy explanations to pretend that actually, there was a people that for some reason that has nothing to do with historical fact objectivity, you root for some contemporary nationalistic and socialistic delusions. And this is true both for the right, for the left. Right. As you know, I believe that whoever manages to rule has essentially the upper hand morally on the one who is under. Because if it weren't so, it wouldn't happen. It's that simple. And that's why people throw in things like, it must have been technology, right? Or those poor people tyrannized by technology. How can you... do you have any technology that manages to trap human thought, that manages to make people think all in a single way? And of course, all the conspiracy theorists will say, yes, because everybody thinks like that. Look at what happened with COVID or whatever. And again, they are, if anything, the proof that evil always needs to dramatize whenever when a personal inferiority is perceived, so that for whichever the reason you're criticized, you become, let's say, a mask, right? A persona, sort of, myth, right? For example, the thing I just said, right? Of course, the person will believe that I am, say, pro-COVID vaccines at any level, or that I believe in the terrible propaganda of the states who wanted to enforce the vaccine. They don't even know what I actually think about that. Which is, yes, rather untypical, what I think about that from both sides' perspectives. And the reason perhaps is that I am a historian, and I was taught a method that I use to understand things, and not just fear and paranoia and the same levels of moral inferiority that the lack of connection between politics and warfare, right, in their understanding, actually teach people about. And that's why also I'm a military historian specifically. The same goes for history, right? If people can't behave so stupidly with such, self-evident topics, like, which kind of everybody knows the thing, can you guess, how they can approach 2 millennia old source without even knowing the original language or the, even less the historical context, and pretending to come up with anything sensible? There are naturally many reasons that today I will not address that have to do with, in fact, the history that occurred after Rome, for which we see Rome in certain ways rather than others. And of course, most people don't even realize that they are the product of that. They have been trained to feel justified in believing whatever they want, so that they will completely skip any self-critical passage, so that they can be weaker and more easily prone to accept whatever they're told. in the same process. The perfect ideology of National Socialism, that is to say, being so obsessed with the shadow of your person identified in an abstract historiographical invention projected in historical times where this thing did not to exist, being minimally hurt because you don't have any other mean to individually provide for any kind of quality otherwise, that you become hysterical whenever what you think, again, that overlaps in theory with your chosen, your preferential, in fact, model, even though you may easily be a product of multiple ones, as all Europeans within the system really are, makes you phobic and hysterical and discontent with that. Like, this is the single most frequent, for example, as a YouTube creator, type of complaint, if I ever get one, right? Not structured, nuanced criticism like this wasn't like that because of this historical reason or this historiographical or philosophical or scientific ground. No, it's just I don't like what you told about the people that I thought I was. I'm still today reading from 2,000 years ago. That's the actual level of, in fact, the complete denial of any traditional value that any people had at the time. And just rest assured that if any of your ancestors of that time had seen what you are today, they would have spit in your face for the disgusting slop that you are. And that's a much healthier thought for rising a dignified human being than the kind of, again, nationalistic or socialistic whining about either your master race or your oppressed people, or all the bullshit that you can come up with really are about. This aspect is, again, I tend always to digress in this, and I hope that you can tolerate my digressions, because I always think, what if a person that has never followed me listens to this video and doesn't understand what I'm talking about? Because I often toy with this thoughts, and I would do without kind of telling them every time, but then I figured out through part also those same type of comments that I get easily misunderstood. That many people subscribe to my channel because they think that I tell things that have nothing to do with actually what I think, just because banally I talk the same thing. I talk about their favorite people in some way, so I must be, from their political side for some reason, and unfortunately it's too often a disappointment for them, right? It was, I consider it unfortunate just for the fact that it's pretty annoying to eventually. I usually don't block, but let's say just to see those comments piled up and just being deleted automatically after 1 month because they're not approved, right? It's just the way the story goes. However, in fact, they disappear because you never find them coming back, and that's also quite interesting in terms of moral resistance / resilience. So that much else could be said. For example, we touched this topic now, how much Romanly we actually think. Like, in that sense, there is no doubt we are still heavily influenced by Roman historiography, by Roman propaganda. There is no doubt about this. People today still believe easily in Augustan propaganda, but is that a negative thing? Are propagandas all bad, right? If there is the propaganda of a good side, why wouldn't you actually agree or accept that? Except, of course, from an historical point of view, people approximate on certain concepts that make you understand that they mostly learned the tale, but then didn't really look at the thing for what it was. It's in the sense that it's often not explicitated. We're talking about a world in which, first of all, certain beliefs, including the right of the stronger to rule on the weaker, were self-evident. So they were not even needing to tell you. All right. So the fact that we historically explain is mostly at least for those who get thoroughly in the in the nuisances of interpreting the mindset of the beliefs, the value system of the time, like what we actually do is to explain contemporary people what this is about. Like most of the history we make is this kind. Here I make disclosure. Of course, I normally don't write about these things. As I said before, first of all, I don't write about Roman history, but in the most of what I do on Schwerpunkt is explaining to, again, someone that maybe has never gotten interested legitimately in some of these topics, and however, aside from the unfortunate way they tend to comment on it without notion, or pretending, at least when corrected, that the thing is still as they would like to, which is not that frequent. I get a very positive response from my audience, which is quite positive. I think it speaks of intelligence, actually. Because I always explain the thing, right? I don't present it to you just, it's the way I say point. No, I'm making the point exactly to get into it, right? To make it successfully and not just in a fideistic sense. At least it would be good if fides was, more rooted in the world today, but any ism is not good for that matter. And again, that's yet another difference that would be very useful to get while approaching history in this regard. But again, it's obvious that much of our forma mentis, as the Latins said, of course, derives from Romans, from other peoples for that matter, and regarding certain aspects of power, especially in the case of Rome. But I will not digress further on the historiographical kind of philological interpretations of how much Rome influenced us in this regard. Let's try to make it simple, somehow theoretical and generic. So there is a trait of Roman civilization that is in this sense difficult to explain if one doesn't get how much, in fact, Rome achieved in practice. That is the practicality, the pragmatism of the Romans. Right? The Roman approach to life was practical and designed to avoid complications. So the military one, as well, that as we've seen was also the most efficient in the Roman culture, reflects this to levels that I think historically have not been met. Right, the Romans surely, like there is an evolution of the art of war, things change, etc. But let's say the degree comparatively of pragmatism that the Roman military showed is still unmatched historically. And we could make a video on this, because don't think that, for example, the contemporary militaries are that practical, that we actually rely on leadership or cadres in general, and on doctrines and theories that are kind of better, not just than the Roman one, let's say from 200 years ago, that, as you get from my avatar, is also a bit the point of this channel. And underlying the Roman military was a core battle infantry deployed as a main line and capable of sustaining a prolonged engagement with the enemy. As we'll see now, the Roman legionnaires, so the Roman full citizens, right? There were different kind of shades of Roman citizenry, including even allied legions at some point. They were, especially in Republican times, quite similar, telling the truth, to the Roman ones, because they came from the same, essentially, Italic background, and they, at the core, first of all, they were trained and equipped also by the Romans after the conquest, but at some point were naturally drawn from what was actually a very common background all over the sedentary ancient world, right? And this is what we have to appreciate in terms of fact of moral differences between the Romans and other peoples, that when we actually look at the way they thought, they were, let's say, from their background, all pretty similar. Right, the Roman legionnaire, we explained it countless times. If you pick it as an individual trooper, and even still contextualize it in the strategical and tactical context for which it was designed, it's not conceptually different from, say, like a Celtic or an Iberian, or a Balkan, or even an Iranian warrior. Right, the perspective distortion that has been, let's say, waged on us by the media broadly meant, like how we came to know about history, the various armies, etc. It's initially there were kind of the Greeks that fought like that, and then there were the Romans who fought like that, and then there were the Vikings who fought like that. And so we think that every people came out with a sort of, at least what is presented in a very often, in fact, entertainmental and artistic sense as, this was unique, right, in its own kind. Right, and there were surely some aspects of uniqueness, as we will see now, but that are very often more invisible. In fact, as we were saying before, they pertain mostly to the political and social system, and that were surely mirrored also in the military one, but not much because of the fact of the material side of the story, or the technical side of the story. In practice, we're talking about very similar peoples. The only, I think, true exception I would conceptualize with some, at least by some degree, were the Greeks. Like, the Greeks properly developed a model that was built on a very idealistic principle that in part was well deserved because of the enormous achievement of the Hellenic civilization, but at the same time would be also its doom in perspective. I made a video about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization in an Indo-European perspective. But because it was based essentially on a material sense of warfare. It is true that the Diadochi and, say, the Macedonian military had in fact emerged from a completely different background. It was essentially a warrior one, and not a very different one from fact which the same Roman emerged. The Macedonian Pezzatari were not very different at all from the Marian proletari in a way, from a political, social point of view, and that's why, in fact, the Macedonians achieved also what the Hellenic polis, in terms at least of this extensive territorial empires, were not able to achieve. But there was an ideal that was still somehow Greek, even among the Macedonians, that limited, in a sense, the potential of their military. And it has to do, of course, with the redemptional impact of the civic rights that the Romans instead immediately understood coming from this extremely crowded and conflictual Italian background, were prone, say, since the beginning, with various degrees, because there was always a huge debate within the Roman politics. We're talking about Tacitus before Caesar making the example, even in military literature, what that practically meant. But that, as you know, as far as the Romans are concerned, overlapped with this, in fact, universal symbolism that is incarnated also by the Gospels, by Christianity, and in actually in a military sense, in a vanquishing sense, properly meant from a moral but also practical point of view. And aside from, I mentioned the Greeks, because aside from the Macedonian phalanx, which is truly a different concept in warfare and a very particular way to war, that is an exception historically, because not even the later pike systems in the late medieval and early modern age are actually comparable. They're a very different context from the Macedonian one, that in fact was truly similar even to the Roman one, much more than we think, but that surely was unique in that specific technicality. And the Greeks, remember, what we get instead from the Hellenic mindset is mostly the scientific thought in a kind of theoretical, methodological sense, but also in this sometimes tendency, in fact, to the abstraction and even to technologism that lived on even in the Roman military, as far as you know, the most important elements of Roman military engineering were somehow mutuated technologically, at least from the Hellenistic militaries, as a matter of fact, and that we have somehow absorbed by saying, oh, look at how the Romans were technologically advanced, right? But Roman military superiority, we explained it, had barely anything to do with technological superiority. As a matter of fact, the Romans took over the world when they were still somehow very primitive compared to especially some of the most advanced Hellenistic eras, and then eventually just later, when they integrated that, the great Hellenistic capitals, their libraries, their scientists, as a matter of fact, they introduced and they improved, in some cases perfected, the Hellenistic technologies, including the military ones. So yes, like if you look at the repeating ballistas, at some of the largest in fact catapults, etc., you really look at something impressive. Like the Romans were aware of that. They thought, buying a bit the Greek thought there in later times, that they had reached the top of human military technology, which is something that, of course, today is laughable. But in a sense, they were aware of that too. But if you look attentively at the entirety of Roman culture, literature, etc., they were really aware of a very different type of superiority that they wouldn't appreciate in technology, if not just by a consequence of it, right? Which is frankly what we should consider today as well, right? There is a reason if, say, the Belgian military or the Australian military are some of the most technologically advanced in the world today, but still the United States are the single most powerful country in the world, militarily speaking, and not only. So that speaks a bit of the same needs that the Romans had, that after all were somehow simple. The Romans very often fought against, in fact, peoples that even deployed important technologies and or tactics. I mean, think about the elephants, think about war chariots, there was a rare but still present use of field artillery, right, that were employed in some circumstances. But the Romans, again, took over the world with this guy, which is essentially the standard warrior / soldier, depending on how eventually you frame it, in which military you frame it, that was present anywhere else in the sedentary world, except from what, again, the Macedonians had developed. That is essentially a guy with an oval shield, a sword, couple of javelins, and that's it. You can essentially armor him more or less, and even in the forms of armor, telling the truth, that the ancient world was pretty similar, right? The Romans didn't invent even the so-called segmented armor. That those things existed since centuries, to say the least, in the Mediterranean. Just look at Pergamon altar, etc. So we tend to attribute a bit too much of that technologism to the success of the Roman military, when it's not even a fact that they copied it. This is yet another thing that I explained countless times. Any expert in history of technology or just economics tells you that technology is just an offspring like of a need for which technology is specifically created to solve. But when there is already a background that has necessitated of it, so the technology doesn't make, for example, tactics. It's the other way around. You develop certain specific weaponry because you are in a strategic or tactical, especially situation, where you need that specific thing that is adapted to it, not the other way around. There is also there is a double thread, but definitely is dramatically imbalanced in favor of the practical need, not of what the technology per se does. Technology per se is zero, right? It's doctrine that makes all the rest. And a people that is able essentially to pick the best from any, without prejudices like saying those are barbarians or those are Greeks, whatever. You just pick the best from the Greeks. You pick a lot of stuff, as a matter of fact, because again, everybody was similar, but to the extremes, the sophisticated torsion engines, catapults, right? You pick it from there. You meet with a warlike Central European culture like the Celtic one that has impressive weaponry developed for the elites in forms of helmets, sword, armor. You actually implement from that. Actually, even in this, many people say, the Romans picked, say, the sword from this people and this from the other. Telling you the truth, if you look at both of the scutum and the gladius, as a matter of fact, these were italic. Many people think that, yep, they say, but how? The Hispaniensis was actually taken from Iberian. It was kind of a mix between the Latin straight blades and the curved copes / Machaerus. That is true. Of course, Rome was influenced in the process, but if you look at the core sword that the Romans used, say, in archaic times, while they were, just pretty much, yes, there were Celts in the peninsula, there were Greeks, whatever, but the core, the essence of the sword were practically the same. The gladius is Samnitic, the scutum is italic. And the fact that other peoples had similar weapons is, how many types is there to make a shield, right? An infantry shield for, hand-to-hand combat in thickly packed formation. How many types of shields do you really want to do, right? There is not a specificity or a, radically varied functionality attached to a specific shape rather than another. For not talking about the fact that even in times where the Roman military was standardized and uniformed and somehow steadily supplied in arms and armor, there was still a wide range of types of weapons that were, however, essentially still the same. A shield, a lance, a javelin, a sword. And yes, they changed somehow, but then, right, how do you think they were used just in specific ways rather than others? Are you one of those people that think that the gladius was just a thrusting weapon? It cut excellently. The Roman military, as essentially all militaries, but surely for the one of, say, war domination is concerned, has regularly the equipment needed to cope with kind of any threat, and especially during the Iron Age, where you don't have really to fill dramatic technological gaps, right? Again, in open field, troops fought basically the same way. Maybe torsion engine catapults were needed to besiege the largest kind of Hellenistic type of cities, and that's why the Romans campaigning in Sicily during the First Punic War began to provide themselves in large numbers with that. But surely they had already seen that around, just they had not employed them as soon as they were not needed, right? It's just like in the early Middle Ages. What's the point of using a torsion engine catapult that requires very specific material, including Asian woman's hair, and I'm not kidding, to what? To besiege a moat, right? It's not even that the knowledge was lost. Crossbows were present throughout all the early Middle Ages. Even the Picts used them. So the definitely technology is overrated in our culture, and it's very often used to, say, give simplistic explanations regarding what properly, even the success of extremely complex and kind of sophisticated military systems are, as the ones that we're analyzing, really were. And the Roman legionnaire was essentially that. And it is true that Rome implemented this type of infantry in ways that, again, looking at the single soldier wouldn't really change much. The average Roman legionnaire throughout these centuries was essentially the copy of a princeps, like with a bit of more of, less of armor here and there, different types of weapons and so on. But the core, the essence, again, is the guy we described before. That has important characteristics. When we will make a video about properly the soldiery per se, today we talk about the legions, but we will realize how For example, important the missile potential provided by the two pila that were specifically designed also to be thrown at a very specific moment of the charge, a very specific distance, um, impacted warfare. Because you say, but Romans, for example, yes, they had auxiliaries as we're seeing now, but they mostly didn't seem to be interested in much more combined arms. They just relied on heavy infantry. Well, heavy infantry can have that missile potential. It was, by the way, second to none against all the enemies that they found. And towards the late Empire, they even increased dramatically the offensive missile capability as well as the defensive one. So we're technically looking in early imperial times, so at the heyday of the Roman Empire per se, even effect of a relatively simpler system. As I was saying before, it's actually in times of crisis that technologies are very often further implemented. This is really evident if you study the Roman equipment of, say, the migration era, right? That they had much greater problems, but in that sense they were trying to economize even on the efficiency. For the efficiency of the single means available, including even increasing the amount of training of hyper specialization, different types of combat, including mounted one, archery, something that on average, like the Roman legionnaires of Augustan times, was not prepared, right? Because it's not even at a point what kind of weapon you have in your hands, but how much you want to kill the person in front of you that makes warfare, right? And never underestimate this aspect, which was constantly forgotten. And that's a bit what was the point. As we were saying, the Romans were dramatically pragmatic. What usually works in warfare is not the most advanced, the most sophisticated, it's the good enough, right? And the Romans had definitely, even though Augustus had surely improved the power of the legions, not much of also of the soldiers, their equipment, the availability of equipment and so on. But even in this regard, let's not overly exaggerate it compared to previous or later times, right? And let's understand also who was fighting alongside the legionnaires at that point. So the legion fought, again, as this corps of heavy infantry, like basically any other sedentary people at the time. Like even the clash between the Roman legion and the Macedonian phalanx is still about this corps of heavy infantry. The fact that the other guys were equipped with pikes, it's not that it made a radical difference in terms of what the frontal clash really was about, nor on the outcome, right? It was pretty evenly balanced with a slight favor towards the Roman one that was, at least in a strategic and political sense, enough to take over Greece in the process. But the Carthaginians fought like that, the Celts fought like that. It's very instructive to read the Hellenic sources that told most of the story of Roman expansion in those years in their native, in its native tongue, in which phalanx is a term standardly used for any heavy infantry. A Greek wrote regularly that the Celtic heavy infantry was a phalanx, that the Roman legion was a phalanx, that the Carthaginian battle line was a phalanx, because it's literally a rolling tree trunk, right? That's what phalanx literally means. It has nothing to do with saying, again, the wargamistic, technologistic idea of it's guys with pikes all thickly packed, as I saw in video games. It didn't even scratch the earth. I considered that the Greeks were much more technologistically biased than all these other peoples. So bear that in mind of how technologistically biased you are today, to think that instead, and on average, how distant we are from the awareness of the actual forces, strength ratio involved in these combats that were pretty interesting for those times, uh, historiographies, literary tastes, and so on, right? So the legionary infantry was assisted by a reserve and cavalry units on the wings, right? This was pretty standard in the ancient world, a simple one, but one which allowed some flexibility and ability to react against unexpected threats. What does this deployment mean? I know that you're thinking, but the Romans had the Accius triplex, and so we'll look at that, and I will explain to you also why, telling the truth, this was used. This could be used at different times, but mostly depending on factors that were not so interchangeable, right? But the core essence, if you look at the major late Republican battles, is just a heavy infantry battle line with cavalry on the wings. Just like, again, the Greek armies were the same thing. The Germanic armies were the same thing. The Celtic armies were the same thing. The Carthaginian armies were the same thing. And you obviously understand that we are talking about pretty balanced odds that are very often also numerical, especially as far as the most decisive battles where more forces and effort in general are committed. There is a symmetry between the armies that, of course, forces you to adopt a somehow standard deployment, which is the one that minimizes the risks and maximizes the advantages in a pretty balanced compromise. It doesn't quite tell you anything about, in this case, say it was a Roman legion or any other people, right? So there was not a special magic tactical formula that the Romans had for winning battles, except they had hell of soldiers that were, again, nurtured in this centuries-old, well-oiled, vanquishing military machine that was motivated to be on the battlefield as much as others were, and the Romans scored victories and suffered defeats, and pretty much everything followed some standards that even in a long-term perspective wouldn't even say, okay, well, this was specifically like a Roman thing. This was the big army of the big empire that thus had developed what normally power of that might really can afford. And again, yes, we should look as always at the psychology of the Roman infantry to realize exactly what that made them so brutally efficient, and why other peoples had somehow troubles at keeping up with them in a way. This naturally has to do with the level of political and social compaction. You can't really have a properly trained or deployed or in general efficient army if you are just a bunch of tribes that quarrel with each other and do not have enough surplus to invest in collective training, and are not already part of some kind of more advanced system. Like it doesn't just like you cannot perform some maneuvers on the field. You cannot immediately. You will feel that asymmetry to the point that you understand why many peoples were conquered by the Romans without even putting up much a fight, because at that point they knew that even if they had taken the field, it would have kind of ended badly for them, and that's the reason why actually wars are fought or not fought in the first place. Because, it's not that in order to do anything, waking up in the morning we have to punch somebody in the face. We cooperate because we realize that if we wouldn't, things would go worse, right? And that's why wars are fought only when you at least believe to have some chances to make it in the first place. And this doesn't really depend even on your military system, but as we were saying before, for the good enough, if you are, say, a frontier people, that Rome doesn't even have much interest, as we've seen, of directly conquering and starting to civilize, etc., can make leverage on that kind of decentralized position, say exploiting Roman civil wars to autonomize yourself a bit further and launching some raid, because you don't have much other ways to accumulate surplus locally due to the shortage of resources. And so even remaining out of the Roman direct control is not really a complement to your own civilization, and there is properly in this sense a civilizational frontier that you can even observe through, say, the Roman frontier is also the one of the grape, because for example, there are some technical reasons that don't make the whole thing, but must is used also as a food preserver. And in some areas, if you could not cultivate vineyards, you couldn't even locally have the means to preserve certain larger amount of grains for supplying mostly the army, which was at the end of the day the only thing that Rome mostly put standing there, aside from, let's say, infrastructures that could be supported mostly in the most centralized and more kind of developed areas in the empire, that surely were carried out by the Romans among peoples that had not seen that before, let's say. But it was much easier to to infrastructurally serve southern Spain or Western Asia Minor than northern Britain, right, or the Danubian frontier at large. So, and this is in fact the actual boundary that the Roman Empire would take, in part for these reasons too, and it all depended on the also the force of the peoples that live there, right, and the outstretching of Roman resources, the need just to add another directly conquered province to an enormous one that counted for the world entire, and that said what was the point of Rome, say, to occupy Scotland at some point. You could bring some advantages. They had to find out whether these were somehow surpassing the costs of it, and as we have explained countless times too, Rome controlled many peoples, even that live beyond their direct area of occupation, and it was enough for them, and they always had this dramatic projectional capability to maintain a deterrent force capable of stabilizing this entire areas, right? So even the destabilization of the Roman Empire is in many ways the cause of its fall from an internal point of view, because in other times, like in Carolingian times, in any other age in which at some point the big giant starts losing breath, like the vultures come to divide the spoils, but for a Pax Romana lasting for half of a millennium in certain areas, you hardly can find that sense equivalent in history, and especially if you consider the relatively even contained amount of resources that Rome spent to keep those peoples at bay, right? And of course, today we're not even talking about the nature of Roman government, but aside from the enormous and evident advantages that you can still see in Europe in the vestiges of the past and so on, you realize that some peoples under Roman rule basically kept living exactly the same way that they lived before, even with some, of course, advantages, but with a relatively superficial amount of Romanization, for which the Romans actually didn't give a damn. Because they were also the least relevant ones, the ones that counted less, controlled the least resourceful areas, and that wouldn't quite even create much of a problem before crisis times that didn't depend on even what these people really thought about the whole thing. So thanks to a proven combat system, the Roman commander mostly just won battles hands down, right? Not in the sense that the strategic or tactical decisions leadership, etc., were not important. But the most important aspect of command was to support the troops by the personal presence and example during battle, right? Because the Roman legions, say in Caesar's times, were already the product of century-old, again, continuous warfare. And as we've seen from the videos on Roman leadership, they basically worked by themselves. The Roman commanders mostly had some years to spend in the military service and then to carry out a fundamentally civilian career that was aware, of course, of the military potential that could still be employed, and some military careers were extended for the more promising elements. But let's say the Roman military in many ways went on, right, his own way with some internal order, but this extraordinary NCOs that were gradually, in fact, ever more professionalized and become permanent figures that also wouldn't write much, or weren't probably of the classes that had a relevance in Roman politics and in government. So we don't have anything from a centurion, for example, but it's obvious that much of what we would like to know about the literal functioning of a Roman legion on the battlefield was, of course, known by the Roman leadership, but it mostly relied on the shoulders of these men and of the same legionnaires. As we have explained, there wasn't even properly a need to provide with military manuals that would explain that in detail, because warfare was so normal that everybody knew how armies practically worked, or at least those who needed to know would learn from direct experience. They were rising in families where essentially the males were all went to war, that were already habituated in the household, as we've seen, to manage properties, slaves, clients. So they had already a command-oriented, say, mentality, right, experience, lifestyle. And they were just taking it to a next level, with the most practical aspects just being taken care of by the lesser ranks. Obviously, a general could contribute to victory through stratagems and particular maneuvers, often drawing from on the examples handed down by his predecessors. It was a true history of the art of war being made in Roman times, and also which the Romans paid the price, also being schooled in that sense. Think about the properly and fully synergic element of all the various arms reached in history in the West by Hannibal, right, and being devastatingly employed against the Romans, that in Scipio, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later Africanus, and exactly Africanus because of this, was learned and used against the same Carthaginians, and after that fundamentally remained the base of, say, military history at the highest levels. And people say that legitimately after Cannae nothing really was invented anymore in strategy, in tactics, as just as a modus operandi. This is actually true, because that, for example, was a type of warfare that had not been brought to that full extent not even by the Hellenistic warfare. Even though Hannibal had an Hellenistic school, he went even beyond that, and the Romans quickly learned from that as well. What is interesting is that there was that time of great conquests, also an older time, a more archaic time, in which, in fact, we recognize this greatest tactical feats, whereas for early imperial times, we know of many battles, etc., but we don't see this dramatic, say, tactical innovation, sophistication, that because everything was already somehow settled, and also the way armies fought was pretty much the same, relying on heavy infantry, you obviously had to mostly think of how to deploy this, either on a single line or multiple ones, exploiting the concept of reserves, but still essentially relying on the strength of your infantry versus the strength of the enemy's infantry. And that was it. Right, on the wings you could maneuver by saying, okay, if I crush the enemy cavalry, I can outflank the enemy and that will probably collapse. You may never know what could happen among the infantry though as well, and very interesting combinations could produce on the battlefields. We don't even know so much about the individual battles. And the reason being that, again, the way tactics worked, also strategy worked, the entire think about the logistical systems that the Romans put together was already well established, and not much further advice had to be done, at least in the sense of providing with a theory that could have a positive practical application. That is something that, again, we achieve by the 19th century, also because of the incredibly larger scale of warfare that began to be, in fact, waged from that time onwards. But in pre-industrial times, you don't really need to have anyone writing down something to teach, hoping to practically teach somebody how to command an army. Right, you will be surrounded just by lots of other officers and that would advise you, that would have military experience. The system was forever standing, and so they were never short out of how to make war. It's just an unrealistic scenario where, why would you even write about how to lead an army if those who do it already find a way of doing it well, right? Consider that wasn't even, as we pointed out in previous videos, a Latin term for strategy, that also in the Greek that we adopted didn't actually mean strategy in the Clausewitzian sense. The use of combats for the end of war, it was not conceptualized. There was no need to maybe we truly will never know, but in a Roman mindset, in a Hellenic mindset, even a Celtic mindset, whatever, this idea was obviously very clear, because when you are involved in command and you just fight basically all the time, every year, especially in those environments where literally, even more actually in a tribal context where everything is so unstable and you have always to fight in one another, you perfectly know what that practically is. You don't even need to conceptualize that, because you already know how to do it. But in Greek, strategy means just essentially what the generals do, right? That's the point of it all. It's a sort of soldiery expertise, right? It doesn't define what strategy is from a practical point of view. A few collections of military expedients have survived. For example, the Stratagemata of Sextus Julius Frontinus, a senator who lived in the late 1st century AD. The practical utility of these works is somehow doubtful. They were supposed to serve as sources of inspiration, rather, reminding commanders especially that it was possible to get out of a thorny situation by sharpening one's wits and exploiting one of the most remarkable characteristics of the Roman army, the aforementioned flexibility. And that is the only, and kind of overlooked, in fact, practical help you can give. If you send young commanders to take care of also delicate situations, militarily speaking, on the frontier, you must spirit them. You must remind them not to give up. That very often, if you are the stronger one, you don't have to be timid. It's human nature to withdraw in that way, but in practice, it doesn't help you, especially when you have the best military available under your command. And it's easy to get scared. It's easy to get dispirited. It's easy to let's say, feel lost in some ways, to feel responsible, because you are eventually expected by society to be militarily capable, right? As we've seen, that was a very important test for the young Roman leadership. And if you if you disparted yourself, well, the entire point of Roman military superiority went out of the window. So it was this constant inculcation of the fact that there is a way out of any situation if you really look at it. And don't be surprised, because this is a Clausewitzian concept. It doesn't mean that there is always a way to say there is always a way to win. This has nothing to do, of course, with whether there is any way to attain it every time. That's properly out of the story, because if such thing existed, there wouldn't even be war in the first place, as we explained before. But again, the idea that if you essentially hold on and you manage to resist, and you are perseverant, and you have a clarity of objectives, and you understand why you're there, why you're doing that, and what is that you want to attain, well, that is already a huge advantage that can be definitely the fuel for this extraordinary military instrument to be properly led and being up to the standards for which achieving the results for which it had been created, right? So it's mostly like a psychological encouragement rather than else. And again, it's completely normal. The first manuals that try to say something more in a truly kind of starting to be a scientific sense rather than a moral one starts in the 16th century. And again, it's not until the 19th with von Clausewitz that we have the full, like, how far can we go in terms of practical advice. And that is, as you understand, they're also focusing dramatically on the moral dimension of the story, because for von Clausewitz, war is a clash between moral forces. But that is referring again to military systems that were much more complex to handle, so that there are some technicalities there that you must properly know, because they're not immediately intuitive. And so just to skip grades, let's say, before you even get in command of any unit, you can learn at least that there is all that range of issues that you have to take in consideration, right, aside from direct practical experience that remains always the single most important military school in a positive practical sense. I insist very much on this because it's, again, pure Clausewitzian theory, and there is a lot of this in Roman culture as well, right? You can argue that the power of civilization resting in the mix between tradition and modernity, in the good sides and the complementarity of them, is somehow manifesting in cultures, depending exactly on their power, on how much morally loaded they are. And in this sense, Roman religion, Roman history, Roman literature provides you with this degree of confidence that, as we've seen, is necessary for undertaking any enterprise, right? This is mostly important for those who commanded the legions as well. Then it's important to focus on what the legions properly were from a technical point of view. Because, as you know, there is all a history of the legion that we were telling before. In theory, the Servian legion was 6,000 men, because there were 60 centuries of, at that point, in fact, 100 men, as the name says. Then things go down a bit. 6,000 is a big number, right? And aside from there's a bit an ideal concept of numerically, because, as we've seen properly, that was the moment in which the Roman army was emerging as such, right, in a statal sense rather than. And so the historiographers probably wanted to set this foundational moment, rather not explaining just how long it took to do it. They attributed to the 6th century BC, and as you know, that was actually happening much later. This is not important. What we start seeing concretely from especially Livian, but concretely Polybian times in an organic sense, is that the legion at that point was 3,600 men, because the centuries were mostly 60 men each at that point. The history is much more complicated than you imagine. Like from Camillian to Livian times, we have the Camillian times would be, let's say, the ones properly of when the legion was born, as such, or at least in the way it remained as this permanent unit in the Roman military till very, very late. It requires another video on its own, because it's an incredibly complicated thing. But let's say for the rest, we understand, of course, these were some thousands of men organized in this democratic fashion, with a different type of equipment for the various battle lines, because this was, for some reasons, a in-depth development that this had occurred essentially as a fixing measure for the original single line formation, because especially at the Battle of the Allia River, the Gauls had outflanked the Roman phalanx, and they had caused the collapse of the entire line. So what we know as the Achaeus triplex is somehow partly a compromise for this. It has to do also with the degree of infantry aggressiveness, in part because as far as you have in-depth formations historically, it's because this one's pushed really hard from the front. So most of the clash had to go by that, and with larger armies that summed up even multiple legions. As you know, originally there were just two at a time, for one for each consul. Then you have multiple legions at a time that are also often think about during the civil wars under strength, and most of these are just blended into a single battle line, and then the idea is, let's just make him fight, and who manages to break more and maintain cohesion will essentially make it without too many sophistications. Also to avoid outflanking maneuvers that were definitely very dangerous, and don't think that in this sense even the Roman legions could easily prevent outflanking maneuvers, right? Even when you have during the Second Punic War this incredible capacity of carrying out actually outflanking maneuvers with the same infantry and showing all that level of training and flexibility. First of all, you don't see it that often later, because there were also different type of wars that were fought during the 2nd century BC that were probably similar, but at least we don't have that, as we were saying before, dramatic military, say, tactical experimentation that had occurred under such extraordinary commanders like the Africanus and so on. But let's say normally any army in antiquity, whenever it was outflanked, collapsed. Right, and that's also the reason, if you look at battles like Pharsalus, the trap that Caesar makes on the flank that makes cavalry in parts apparently not holding, or at least trying to hold, but the Pompeian one was stronger, but he hides a cohort behind that and kind of ambushes them. That tells you apparently how relatively simple, according to the stories, by the way, that may have been naturally simplified, but this tactics were, but at the same time have also, as we were saying before, symmetrically necessary such level of simplicity really was, right? And how much, of course, most of the battle was about the general strength of the army, and also the comparable one, especially think about the Civil War, Romans fighting against other Romans, and this is valid for most peoples. I mean, Celts mostly fought against other Celts, Germans fought mostly against other Germans. The same goes for the Diadochi and so on. So you, and as we were saying before, these corps of heavy infantry battle lines were pretty much all what the peoples used, right? How you think, I don't know, a clash, a triumvirate war between the Roman legionnaires and a Germanic infantry line in fact really was. They were basically fighting in the same ways, right? There is a lot of debate which is purely speculative, because notoriously there is no evidence of sort in the entire military history of Rome to say how, say, for example, the cohorts or even single centuries alternated in combat, all these kind of things. The mutatio, for example, is merely speculative. It was probably not even used because, frankly, also in a comparative sense, the alternation of battle lines is something that happens much more on a large scale, not on small unit tactics with guys that switch the ranks internally to the formation. It doesn't make much sense, right? Everything in tactics too is much more simple than it really seems, because it gets down to, again, getting against these whole speculations divert from the fact that you have to get straight against that guy in front of you and disemboweling. Mostly they kill each other in other ways, but that could happen as well for that matter. But it's that aggressive physicality, which is very evident, especially in Roman warfare, for example, and also saying Celtic one, etc., compared to the Greek one, because the Hellenic formations, the Hellenistic ones, if you look at them, they were all kind of unbalanced on one side. Because one, say, there was a top wing that was also the punching one, the right one, and there was this old legacy of the shield that the importance of which is revealed in Hellenic warfare by the fact that units were called by the names of shields. That kind of shifted the formation towards the right, because they wanted to cover more the part of the body was not covered by the shields. This in part speaks of the gentrification and the relative materialism, especially of political warfare. But this lived also in the professional Macedonian one that still had essentially an infantry that actually fought pretty hard, but had still relatively few losses, and the whole point was just outflanking it, right? Instead, if you pick an Italic army, an Iberian army, a Gallic army, you realize that all these formations were symmetric. That is to say, they were purely frontally oriented. They were about going straight at the enemy without too many tactical sophistication. It was an incredibly brutally direct, hand-to-hand physical thing, for which, in fact, the legionary is practically designed, right? To presume that the Roman legionary is somehow less kind of a cleaner trooper that just fights minimalistically is a pretty grave mistake. The Roman legionaries had a taste for decapitations from blood. They were properly still drawn from backgrounds that were barely secularized and modernized. The Roman legionary emerges from an Italic military background that is, believe me, something that you would have not liked to experience firsthand, and that was based on levels of plain butchery that even with, look at the blades. There is the Lanuvius warrior that has a coppice of something of like 70-80 centimeters. What's the difference with a Latin sword, right? Opologically speaking, asking whether a straight blade is better or worse than a curved blade is like asking whether a black or a white cat is better to catch a mouse, right? It doesn't make any sense in practice. Of course, the Roman legionnaires' equipment evolved. It is true that it went towards kind of a more thickly packed kind of fighting style, with the gladius becoming somehow more thrusting oriented, but not because it ever lost its cutting potential. And consider that aside from the auxiliaries, but even the Roman cavalry used still preferentially somehow Sparta kind of if not spatas properly, but somehow longer blades, right? Also as the early gladius hispaniensis really were, right? There is this idea that the gladius was a sort of leaf-shaped thing. The early gladi, if you look at them, the Hispaniensis types, they're pretty broad, long swords, right? They have a dramatic chopping capacity. So this entire idea that the gladius was a sort of just a stock for thrusting is, in my opinion, very incorrect from an anthropological point of view. And aside from the evidence that occurred, even this trend over time doesn't actually support, in the composition of the army, the fact that the majority of troops used somehow more cutting weapons at large, and that the gladius disappeared in favor of the spada in a relatively few centuries again. So it literally came back to that kind of Latin model that both the Germans and the Romans at that point had derived from the Celtic forms, largely, right? This is particularly important. But having affirmed this kind of legionary profile, what was the deal of the legion? Why do we say that it was flexible, that it was kind of so easily deployable, etc.? When we talk about the manipular legion, in spite of this greater flexibility in the form of different battle lines, that still entail that you can find a ground where you, as some closed Italian ones can be, right? Mostly a hilly ground, etc. So where you can have, say, protected sides and so on. That depends also on how many men you have, what's this, the breadth of the battle line and so on. But still, the manipular legion contained this pretty frontal dimension designed for like single pitch battles in that frontal struggle, and it wasn't really trained up to the Second Punic War to carry out any other particularly sophisticated or complex, or if you want to call it flexible, in fact, maneuver, such as the ones carried out by Scipio in Spain, in Africa, that basically made the posterior lines literally wheeling like as columns, like making a semicircle from the rear, arriving on the side of the enemy in the front, while the first line blocked them. And I made a video about the Battle of Ilipa that illustrates that. But there are other examples. We will talk about those tactics more specifically. But as we have also seen, that was somehow peculiar of Scipio. We don't really find it anymore. We know that, however, during the 2nd century BC, and actually under Scipio, the term Semaia in Greek appears from Polybius. That means literally troops that are under a same banner. Doesn't actually refer to any other specific technicality. It simply means that what before were, let's say, the triplex acies, fundamentally subdivision trooper types of the Astati, the Principes, and the Triarii, that basically were conceived to fight only in that line in succession, were kind of grouped. The different elements from the, say, elements from this different lines according to the tactical strategic needs under a banner created ad hoc and sent as perhaps even in fact still a section of the in depth of the entire formation. And that's the concept of the cohort, as a matter of fact, a term which actually already appears in Latin to call the units specifically of the Italic allies, that however seemingly has nothing to do with any organic issue. That doesn't matter the fact that the Italics had kind of apparently larger formations. It may have even had to do partially with that, but they were still trained the Roman way, and the Romans began, and that was still kind of within Italy, and in part still somehow seasonal type of warfare. So that's the reason why I don't think that it has anything to do with the cohort later. That instead is exactly this: is the 10th section in depth of the entire legion that was evidently conceptualized as such from within the Manipular Legion, that also from an administrative point of view maintained in Marian times, in Augustan times, and beyond the concept of that the first maniple was the Astati, the second the Principes, and the third the Triarii, despite apparently all the soldiers at that point were somehow uniformed. And why? Because evidently the tactical functionality that the cohort had to carry out was essentially splitting from the main body, and not much in the, as we've seen, line type that Scipio's flanking maneuvers were entailing, but literally as a self-standing tactical unit that didn't even have to fight together with the legion, let's say in some cases. So in other words, the Romans wouldn't have reason to split specifically just all the Astati together and Principes together and Triarii together. That was good as far as the concept of reserve in a single battle was concerned, so that you could choose who was the strongest and the weaker for the general praxis. At some point, actually, the order was inverted in archaic times. If you speak about the Livian Legion, there were some changes. And that could, in fact, depend just on the will of the commander. Albeit in Polybian times, we seemingly that the order, right, of the weaker in the front and the stronger in the rear was applied. And that's wholly relative, again, because if you have an enemy that has a broad front that can envelope you, you have to extend your front as well, and you have to invent some things. And we are not so documented to know how this was actually carried out. So the only thing we understand is that even the manipular formula in a kind of categorical stereotype way, of course, was subject to changes, to modification. It's also the same Scipio's tactical accomplishments show. What really seems to have happened is that this was mostly a necessity stemming from a strategic and primarily, as always, point of view. That is to say, especially when the Romans, from the Second Punic War onwards, began to lord over faraway countries and becoming de facto occupation forces, they needed to, especially in the Iberian hinterland, it was quite vast and not just controlling, in fact, the coastal rich places that were somehow easy to rule over. They needed to split forces. They need to occupy larger areas, and thus, especially against guerrilla, it was very complicated to contrast the enemy by just having a concentrated force like the single legion just locally. So what the Romans thought to do was to split the legion in different smaller legions, still developed in depth, hence the cohort with the single maniples of the Astati, the Principes, and the Triarii in the same process, and scattering them in the Iberian hinterland at some distance, occupying some stronghold and covering multiple places at once, which is, of course, an important strategic counter-insurrectional measure that the Romans were also beginning to specialize in beautifully. And Caesar's Commentarii, the Bello Gallico, are a manual of counter-insurrectional strategy that shows you exactly how that happened, how the various legions, detachments were capable of moving, how they occupied this enormous Gallic space, by the way, basically without any other support either than the deterrent of the same legions, right? So that's how the cohort came to be, rather than Marius invented the cohort because he had to withstand the charges of the Cimbrians, etc. Even assuming that that may have had anything to do to, let's say, with a broader flexibility of the entire legion, still the depth of the single units or the single cohorts was identical to the manipular one, because they were just a section of the previous one, except what now the Roman army had become was a much more professional permanent force, where the cohorts now actually could be combined into different formations, about which also we don't know too much. We know some arrays, but we don't know of any. Of course, first of all, not of any standard one. But in this sense, you had truly a more flexible system from before, where you have just the 3 lines that were also not trained to ever split or to envelope or whatever. You had just tactically autonomous mini legions that the cohorts fundamentally were, that you could arrange in a wide multitude of ways, just because, again, the collective training, the professionalism of these troops had radically increased. And why did it have increased? Because essentially the older peasantry, soldiery, that made up ideally the guy with his own equipment, that was still, in fact, democratically represented by the difference in equipment between the Estati, the Principes, and Triari, had disappeared because of the recruitment crisis, of the dramatic impoverishment of the Roman middle classes, and thus just everybody could join as long as they were Roman citizens. And this is the only thing that Marius changed. It's a purely political reform. Now also those who didn't have anything could join the army as long as they were Roman citizens, and they were fundamentally controlled by a state that had the means to monopolized by these oligarchic warlords that largely paid with their own private enormous resources, latifundia, these legions, and thus that could enforce a subtle discipline that was by far more brutally collective, and thus capable of making these troops carrying out maneuvers, deploying, fortification building, that before was not so intense, effective, and standardized. You can even argue that the Roman, let's say even the quality of the Roman equipment may have not necessarily increased so much during Marian times. It is true that Rome was rich and invested always a very important amount of resources in its own military, but the fact, as it happens in other times historically, that you increase collective training that costs, by the way, a dramatic lot, and so you can practically increase the overall power of the unit without essentially having to increase also for example, the individual equipment of the single soldier, because what matters is how fast they line up, or they march, or they maintain cohesion. And so at that point it doesn't matter whether they're actually, could even hamper them to be heavier. May have in fact produced even cheaper, kind of more state or subcontracted say state production of arms and armor. You see, by the 1st century BC, books say, well, you see that the Laurica Armata extended more towards towards the knees, and so it seems that there is some extra layer there also on the shoulders for parrying blows. This is also true, so I'm not saying that the quality of the equipment decreased, but let's say it wouldn't be so strange actually if a princeps of the 3rd century BC had actually a slightly finer type of properly of arms and armor quality, as opposed to the standard Marian legionnaire, especially during the civil wars, where they had to enlist hundreds of thousands of people and equipping them with literally whatever they found, very often also allies, arms and armor, and so on. So the thing is complicated. I'm not going to descend in it, but just for saying that it's the increasing collective training and discipline of the Roman army that renders the cohort possible, because it's not just this single line, even with different lines in depth, let's say, that has to remain that and nothing else, and cannot move, cannot wheel, whatever, or at least it's an extremely complex thing to make them do. Now you have all different tactical units that can be very flexibly used here and there and fight essentially all with the same potential. And that's why uniformity came about. Literally, Marius didn't change anything about any aspect of the equipment or the tactics or the organic. It was already everything completely, totally there from a long time, and it just formalized the organizations, the procedures, and so on. But he didn't really add that much. Armies evolve already by themselves, and it's already the imperial nature of the Roman domination that had brought to the necessity of having troops that spent their entire life as soldiers, as they would do formally later with the Augustan, say, professionalization, permanent service, so permanent units and so on. This was the actual flexibility of the Roman army. This is the point. Like, say, a Celtic host at this point would have been, on average, about different clans deciding to go at war and having to negotiate for how long, and with, again, tribal, for example, systems that could not support too long that army on the field. All kind of decentralized without a unity of command. They wouldn't trust, of course, the sum of these tribal forces to a single guy, but still they would command them from the field in a way that was their contingent, and this guy would have been given some degree of autonomy, for example, if he was capable or not to line up these troops in a way rather than another, if they had time, if there was some time to, in fact, to train them further in that temporary moment to work together, because they normally weren't together, right? So that entire collective training also costed too much. Nobody would pay for it collectively, because it would also unavoidably give more power to one or the other of the tribes, and they didn't want that. And just when the Metus Hostilis also from their side arrived, say the Romans invaded, they would put these forces together, but it was mostly like this stand. They were orderly, by the way. There was a battle line, there were wings, there was kind of an aptitude to war, but the point is that they had a much lesser training, right? Most of these forces were not professional. The average warrior was surely aware of raiding warfare and surely able to cut throats and killing people without any problem. But as far as coordinating, remaining information, having been brutalized to maintain the post, to be part of a unit that was thought to, that didn't even exist, because there was no such thing like a permanence in that. There was, yes, a sense of belonging in the tribe, etc., but this tribe was limited in power, whereas if you belonged to a Roman court, you were part also of a legion, or more permanent, and well, as we've seen, much more traditional military system that was properly standardized according to those practical, brutal, collective training capacities of changing formation, marching, building camps. Roman legionaries were fundamentally assault engineers, right? We know archaeologically that the Gauls, the Germans, didn't have this. They had their own kind of narrower version of the story, but they marched more slowly. They built more primitive fortifications. They didn't have the organization. They didn't have the resources. Even on the spot, like to invest morally for the cooperative success of the enterprise, right? And as a consequence, when meeting with a drilled infantry who just was able constantly to time the charges, that had practiced it all before over and over and over again collectively together, that could alternate, in this sense, the battle lines in a swifter fashion, that could, in this sense, just be in the role of being able to build a camp in every single situation, because they had done it so many times before that was always the same camp, or at least it was built in a way in which everyone knew exactly which place to take, how to arrange the entire say baggage, the train, whatever. This thing, right, had such a greater cohesion. It would simply smash the more fragile system. Doesn't matter how loaded those warriors were, say, even in kind of individualistic ethos and in pride, whatever. Without an effective cooperation with one another, they didn't have an advantage. They wouldn't know how to exploit the tactical or strategic opportunities. They were always also one step away from, say, politically say dividing, because maybe one situation favored the other rather than another. Rome had instead a much broader scope, right? The competition was a much larger scale, and in a local sense, the strategic objectives were much more clear and obvious and uncompromising, and that kind of clarity did bring a lot of order in the affair as well. So again, was there a huge distance between the two systems? No, there wasn't. But Rome took over this entire others without the others even basically making a coming back, whatever, actually undergoing Romanization, and that's it. It's meaningful that, for example, the Germans were more politically cohesive than the Celts. Even though they were more primitive, you can argue that it was like the Romans versus the Greeks. Like there was this kind of capacity, right, to see more clearly war and the opportunities of an imperial, of an expansional practice, a greater aptness to arms. So for which we know that, for example, the German battle lines were somehow more cohesive, and they would retreat in good order, carrying away the wounded, whereas the Celts would mostly invest in this initial wild, furious charge, and then they broke if they couldn't break the enemy in the process. Of course, this is a bit stereotypical because there was a lot of in between, for which it's also not really helpful to distinguish so much the Germans from the Celts or the Dacians, let's say. But you can appreciate that some systems, like for example, the German were somehow more militarized than the Celts that had already somehow softened up and being contained in their expansion capabilities by the 3rd century BC, and mostly lording over with an enormous disproportion between the wealth of the elites and the one of the other peoples that, however complexively, didn't even have the surplus for creating a broader statal reality, and thus not being able to invest in, militarily speaking, more of some war bands that would be basically the only professional element roaming around and trying to create their own state. Yes, but again, very slowly and gradually, and in a way that simply couldn't match the unity of the Roman army, which again absolutely doesn't mean unity in terms of bigger. The Romans took over Gaul in 8 years, and it remained there for half of a millennium. So there is no game, no match. The way Britain was conquered also was kind of embarrassing. The thing of say fringe areas carrying out guerrilla just out of the fact that they were so primitive, couldn't be integrated in the system, is not the stand of an alternative cultural option. It's just the unaccomplishment and the failure of a fringe reality, right? Until this concept is not properly ingrained, one cannot really appreciate it. What the same is in part true also for, let's say, the Germans, if they hadn't been always so threatening on the same frontiers. Yes, for some times they weren't particularly a problem for Rome, and they definitely weren't compared to other Eastern threats that, especially as far as the Arsacids were in power, were not even that big. But at least the Germans maintained always the idea of let's say, we could expand, right? Or at least they were able to resume it in somehow larger confederal scale, to the point of finally making it true. But while it was the Roman Empire that had already largely exhausted and fragmented by itself, right, to let the minority in to make up for essentially the military strength and still maintaining, in fact, only the post-Roman were the same cultural balance and somehow continuation, even a Roman institution during the, in fact, Romano-Germanic times, as we've seen in the videos during the migration era. So this aspect of saying, why were the Romans so, after all, qualitative, it's of course in absolute terms true, but it depended on also the single legion, it depended on the single campaign, the single battle, the single commander, right? And flexibility in Roman legions was also ensured by the allied contingents, the one of the Salci, that is to say the allies, later by the auxilia, so called, and the etymological difference standing essentially between an ally and an aid, rather. So the idea that first Rome was mostly, in fact, involved in creating and consolidating this Italic confederacy and dominating it, and bringing with those forces Roman power abroad, and then whereas afterwards it was mostly the auxilia in the form of local subjected peoples, a bit in the same way, but mostly seen as true outsiders in some way, and or reinforcements sent by allied powers that were, however, outside sometimes even properly the Roman, that pointed the much more developed ways of Roman occupation, and that would have a stricter distinction between those who were inside or outside from a political point of view. And at that time, the Italics having already been properly Romanized and being fully part of, say, of the Roman thing by some degree. So the auxilia were recruited meaningfully from among those who did not have Roman citizenship. Instead, the Salci, by some degree, had, for example, there were some forms of Roman citizenship that were more or less military in nature. Rome needed also some mercantile activity that they delegated to other allies. For example, the Latin citizenship was much less of a military one than the Roman one. It was instead seen as a duty privilege, and also connected with the process of Roman colonization that was the one of not just of population but in occupation, but also of garrison, at least initially, right, and or as a prize, especially from the late Republic onwards, in the newly conquered provinces, like saying, you have fought here or somewhere else and I will give you a piece of that land that you grabbed yourself. And as we've seen in previous videos, the auxilia were quite driven to obtain Roman citizenship, right? Later on, things came to be also a bit more mercenary-like, especially after the 3rd century, when the internal situation of the Roman Empire had brought to the gentrification a bit of all, even the most combative peregrini within, say, Roman boundaries. But these forces before that were just as combative and trained as the legionary troops, and we often say don't appreciate this enough, because they were essentially the same peoples Rome had just conquered. They often fought even still with their own, as auxilia, with their own contribution. I mean, it was essentially the local subject tribes that provided with important amounts of troops. Sometimes they could even be elite. And we have this idea the auxilia were less than the Roman legionaries, but very often were given by the Roman military not just the right training, but also the same equipment, especially considering even the better ones at some time, because they were the ones who fought more often than the same legionnaires. These auxilia had a wide range of specializations, right? So this depended mostly on the local people that naturally was better suited to fight in the region, right? According to the customs of the rebels, the neighbors, etc. So they were just perfect for, say, screening the Roman legions, and in this sense were just thought like as if they were the center of the universe, and this swarming of subjects paved the way for their arrival as a sort of divinely commanded force that would eventually just bring, just like on the chariot, the hero in to challenge in single combat the best opponent in heroic warfare, not his retinues that were not even heroes technically, right? So it was the same identical concept, but it's obvious that in prolonged campaigns, etc., also the auxilia had basically the same degree of training, of professionalization earned on the field, and they could be equipped accordingly to what the mission required. Did auxilias wear the heaviest Roman arms and armor? Of course they did. And if they were the only ones to fight in a single engagement, why not? Maybe this was just a detachment that had to go somewhere where the legion remained in the fort. On the frontier, of course, they would be given what they needed, given that the other troops were just within. And the Romans were, in this sense, extremely demanding on the auxilia. These men really earned their citizenship because the Romans exploited them to the fullest. They didn't need to discontent the Roman citizenry to do that. The legionnaires were surely trained to carry out the most brutal massacres that were brought in properly during pitched battles or when they had to storm fortresses. So they needed this high concentration of top quality heavy infantry and all their technical capabilities, artillery, for which they were excellently trained altogether. But it's obvious that the auxiliaries would provide always with this support in every circumstance. As you know, in Augustan times, their specialties were formalized also from an organic point of view. In infantry cohorts, cavalry wings, the ally, and also mixed formations, the cohortes equitatae, which shows you, of course, that cavalry and infantry always somehow cooperated, and that they always needed mutual support, so that the cohortes equitatae, people say, well, they started appearing later in the early empire. It's a bit like the vexillationes that mixed cavalry and infantry, because before it didn't happen. That always happened, right? Just the difference between legionnaires and the tactical properly divide between the legionary heavy infantry and all these other specialties before, in the moment in which Rome had freshly conquered the world from mostly this kind of Italic or better Italian background, because it included also at some point also the north of Cisalpine Gaul. The major amount of these territories, and so the difference between the conquerors and the conquered was sharper. It's obvious that after centuries, more or less people were more prone to mix, to grow, let's say, to specialize in ways that were more side to side in the same units, right? A bit like later with the 4th century Roman army, where everybody was a Roman and there were all types of soldiers, of course. The auxilia provided the armies of Rome archers, slingers, skilled horsemen, light and fast foot soldiers to operate in difficult terrain, because they were, it's true, generally lighter, but not always lighter. The finest archers came. Actually, there was not really a dramatic divide. Sometimes we think that archers were more an Eastern thing. Yes, it's true, tendentially, archery was more around in the Eastern areas because of the steppes, because of the mostly of the steppes, even in the Middle East, telling the truth, but also because in the East there were sometimes cultures with more kind of mass classes that were the say the pacified, the militarized, and so actually most of what they could put together was either some sort of light infantry or militias, but it was mostly the influence of the steppes that we tend to overlook. But there were lots of archers coming from everywhere, telling the truth. They just weren't necessarily better than slingers, right? There is a debate. I made a video about this too. Like, were slingers better than archers in the ancient world? Some said yes, right? And they were quite effective. We know, especially the Rhodians, the Balearics, stereotypically, but you could find them pretty much everywhere. Skilled horsemen, right? The Thracian ones, the Mauryan ones. Those infantries, think about the Batavians, like among the central Europeans. Well, those were tough, right? At the Battle of Mons Graupius, it was the Batavians that basically massacred the Caledonian army alone, right? Where the legionnaires simply watched, right? Because it was just like a show for them, because they saw it like that. Just like Flavius Josephus really says, for the Roman legionnaires, battles were just training in which they spilled a bit of blood, right? But just for saying that Rome really squeezed the allies, and this was the only way, according to their mentality, to make them earn the Roman citizenship that equated to the imperium. So a freedom that had been earned through military service that was still successful, whether under because it was under the Roman imperial leadership, because no other power could derive but from God, and this passed through the commander-in-chief, as we've seen, of the entire Roman military, that is the emperor. In fact, what we call early imperial times, it was true also for any magistrate who had the imperium before that commanded the troops. This was pretty, understood by the same auxilia. They didn't think they were truly fighting for themselves. They were fighting under Rome, and they thought they could be redeemed in that regard, so that even the later auxilian, say the Federati, Federati not so much per se, but still there was the idea that Rome had at that point crystallized the concept of imperium. There were lots of foreign troops that went to fight for the Romans as a living, and then they came back. They didn't stay in the empire. They came back where they came from to live in their last lives with their money. And yeah, the local politics also provided them with a minimal stability to enjoy their final years, with that awareness that they had been proud locals, whatever tribe, people they belonged, but they had been Roman soldiers. And for them this was a huge deal, and it was perfectly normal to consider the world just ruled by this empire, was out there, maybe not directly controlling your own land, but still somehow encompassing it. In its most mature expression, the Roman army perfected its flexibility of views. Right, the legion had to prove effective in battle as much as in sieges, by the way, in the occupation of garrisons, and also in the event that it was necessary to put down some insurrection. So, as we've seen, the legion had particularly developed formally to provide, especially with the latter's capacity, right? Maintaining under subjected peoples with, as we will see now, an enormous also siege, say properly fortificatory capacity that was unknown technically for what they could afford from most of the especially most rebellious peoples that, as we've seen, were the more complicated to handle, but that the Romans managed largely to, in fact, to pacify. The Roman legion essentially developed to march neatly, right, and well protected through hostile territory, to throw bridges over rivers, to erect fortifications, and to build siege engines. There was a find in the very heart of Germany, and local archaeologists found that this thing was apparently a Roman fort. I don't know how the digging went, and the first thing they said, noticing the structure, is, the locals didn't build any of that, and so that is the actual impression, that even these technical capacities, yes, but the fact that they were carried out by men would impress the subjected peoples. I mean, that was a mean of displaying Roman power. If you read, in fact, the Bello Gallico, Caesar's bridge on the Rhine was like the Germans were and it was extremely successful in function of the strategy that Caesar was carrying out, that is deterrence, the same one that he waged in Britain, right? You dare interfere in Gaul, I will exterminate anyone I find there. And that's what he literally did, and that's how Gaul wasn't touched from the outside, because the Britons were interfering, the Germans were interfering. Those expeditions, they didn't bring to any occupation, but they were a perfect success because the frontier there was established, and again, Gaul was one of the greatest successes of Romanization by far. And the core concept of having an armed force that can display in front of the enemy the erection of massive siege engines, catapults, fortresses. Just think about Alesia, think about Masada, think about some of the finest fortificatory systems that were literally invented also on the spot, because the Romans, as we've seen, were habituated just by the foe. Like, the first command in the 1st century BC was of men who already knew perfectly how to build forts. The commander didn't have to teach them, they would just do it. And it was it, right? The centurions supervised that, the tribunes did, and the whole machine was already set in that way. And all this with some, as we will see now, specific orders of march, in which the allies had a specific place, because they had also specific tactical roles in the event of ambush. All was planned to make everything the smoothest possible way, preventing, again, this night attacks, ambushes, erecting this pretty homogeneous fortifications that were known thus also at night, but in case of attack by every legionnaire, spatially, that were functional to also sorties, redeployment. So something, again, that the Romans had, as the story goes, had learned from Pyrrhus, but that they topped at a level that in the ancient world would be unknown. In fact, until then, every possible and imaginable military function could be carried out thanks to the particular composition of the ranks and hard and continuous training. I will make a video exclusively on Roman training, because if one doesn't properly understand what a legionnaire underwent on a regular basis in the Roman army, you can't understand why you would have not liked to meet a Roman legionnaire in in combat, because again, it's moral before else. These men were habituated to do things for which what you were habituated to do comparatively was just like what a fly would do, right? So the immediate need to smash you and getting you out of the way was just the first motivational force of the Romans. Flavius Josephus is very clear about this. The ego under which that they follow, let's say, is to them an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. Polybius is very clear about the Roman legionaries. If properly equipped, he can take on any enemy, even in single combat, in collective formation. It's information in any situation. So just think about what this means from a aptitudinal, behavioral, psychological, moral point of view. It means that you are basically living solely as the purpose of being a combat machine. These were constantly inculcated, that they were the chosen people, that they were destined to conquer the world, that any person that put themselves between them and their goal had to be massacred, and that there was nothing else greater than Rome, and that everything had to be done in her name, and that this would bring them essentially to salvation, as they would have died as heroes in the worst of possibilities. And these people were working for actually getting also a dramatic promotion, getting land, a future, as we've seen the auxilia, the rights of Roman citizens. Just think, as we have explained so many times, what it meant for a conquered people, the chance that Rome gave of redemption, to the point of making even the subject peoples rising at the same level of the conquerors and enjoying all the privileges that this entailed, right? And if they had earned them. So there was a radical competition, because power was real, and these men could grab other power for Rome and earning part of it in the process. As a consequence, you understand, given the vastity of the Roman conquests, the balance between the components of the legion could easily be recalibrated to better adapt to the, in fact, quite diverse geographical scenarios and the peculiarities of the enemy. It was not just a matter of auxilia. The Romans always had, say, since the first conquest of Latium, more Sulci, more auxilia, more non-Romans politically than legionnaires, in fact, in their army. So they always fought with someone who, say, knew better than them what the land where the Romans stepped on really was. Also with risks. Just think about Arminius and Varus and so on. And people say, well, the Romans fell in so many ambushes, like on the Caudine Forks, on the Trasimene, Carrhae, the battle to the Bur Forest, and more, right? To say, like, they didn't have scouts. Some people say they didn't have scouts, explorers. That is what happens when you have an occupation army that marches in somebody else's land. So it's kind of obvious, aside from the Trasimene River, where you have there one of the greatest geniuses in military history, carrying out the ambush par excellence in the entire military history, so you can maybe use it as an exception. Pretty frequently ambushes in to an occupation force, right? So independently, actually, from their means of spotting ambushes that were quite sophisticated in the Roman army, thanks to the same auxilia, but also lighter forces, well, you have to consider that legionnaires themselves, exactly for still the relation with these foreigners, were quite cautious. And the Roman legionnaire could actually adapt to any tactical circumstances, as we've seen, so much that it's very frequent in Roman sources to read. Caesar says it very beautifully many times, given that he was also an expert in forced marches and so on. That legionnaires could switch equipment, could abandon the heavier one, because, say, mobility could be more in time, thus could be more important than protection in combat. And there was a balance in that. And Romans were trained in that sense for all, right? Legionnaires could be this kind of heavy infantry, could be assault troops, could be military engineers, could be skirmishers. Like, consider that the pila that we mostly conceive like being thrown during the charges, only on one very instances in Caesar we find them used defensively, but that tells you essentially, in fact, how flexible the employment of these weapons also could be. Must have been actually employed mostly during the skirmishes during combat, because these battles lasted days sometimes, and you realize that, of course, troops cannot fight for more than a few minutes straight, so most of the time was surely spent throwing missiles of any kind. And the same legionnaires would use their pit at some point if there wasn't like a climatic charge. And by the way, we know they carried two individually, but what the hell do we know about supplies? Maybe they threw 8, but that we cannot reconstruct on the base of the sources. But it's just that's the scale which we don't know. Essentially the most famous army in history. And the same must have been true also for other peoples, for that matter. And it's obvious that the lighter the enemy troops, the more kind of guerrilla suited they were, and the more harassing rather than decisively punching they were. Because if you skirmish, if you carry out guerrillas, because you're basically, it's not that you can't fight hand-to-hand fight, everybody can. Those very troops as well, especially against each other, given that at that point they're somehow symmetric. It simply means that you control the lands from which you can be equipped only with like that, or at least not being able to carry out a kind of showdown in open plains, in open battles, where the Roman infantry was notoriously like a steamroller, right? And this is generally the attitude that you find, right? The great peoples, say, that took on the Roman legions in open field were, generally speaking, the most advanced. The others tended to make showdowns, for strategically speaking, there was a chance for them to shine, but tendentially, we're talking about the histories, again, of peoples that either were rebelling after having been already conquered, or because Roman domination had become too oppressive, and at that point the Romans were really without scruples, because they would be practical, very practical at sometimes at killing some kind of innocent peoples that just, however, in terms of political strategic balance, were a bit of a problem, and maybe sparing some rebels that had even betrayed the pact with Rome. But the praxis was, generally speaking, that I invade you because in general you have done something that, at least according to me, was not right. You want to fight? Okay, I respect you for that. I defeat you. I respect you for that too. You lost, so by universal rule you're under, and I will treat you the way that entails. But as we've seen, Rome was there to stay often, so the idea was, let's also co-opt the elites and let's try to cooperate. But at that point, if you had been crushed, because evidently at some point you had stopped resisting, you had surrendered some way, and thus swore that you wouldn't rise again, and you did rise again, then I wipe you out of the face of the earth. And this is the reason why there are surely lots of peoples that, aside from say, the general understanding that it was somebody inhabiting some areas we don't know exactly the name of, like, was cancelled also from memory by the fact it was literally made a desert of by the Romans, right? And also because, of course, you can argue by being the devil's advocate that, we're just not, there were so many different tribes, clans, whatever, that you couldn't know them all from the ancient world. But an interesting part of them was literally cancelled even from the memory of existence by the Romans, right? Again, we have a pretty good idea of who inhabited were, telling the truth, that we can reconstruct thanks actually to classical historiography, but it's obvious that we would be surprised by how many other small wars were fought about which we don't know anything, because just they weren't big news, and that instead were surely the history of peoples who fought for their liberty, also for wrongdoing, right? The same Rome at some point had her own reasons, and it was just that struggle for power. One of the most characteristic aspects of Roman warfare was the building of camps to accommodate the troops after the march, notoriously enough. The castrum. The castra existed in various shapes and sizes, right? They weren't literally all alike, right? The Romans came to exemplify, I made multiple videos on Roman camps, I will keep making them, some plans, right, that were kind of instructively shared in the Roman establishment, saying, we want to make a good camp, make it like this. And of course, Romans were trained, even in peacetime, to literally every day building a camp wherever they went. When in kind of, say, not necessarily hostile, but say, where there wasn't territory, but where there wasn't any other place to really stay. This was part of the training, right? And these camps sometimes were huge, because the Roman armies included also multiple legions plus auxiliaries of double at a time. So it happened that, famously enough, the Roman camp would start being built at the moment in which the one that had spent the previous night was being abandoned by the column, let's say, for how stretched it really was. But it was a matter again of affirming that kind of aptness, of commitment, of acquired discipline for the Roman army. It was a moment of huge pride, because when they left the camp in the morning, the commander said, "Are you ready to leave?" And everybody shouted yes. Like, it was a way properly to identify. Just think about what it means to be part of a corps of that kind. You feel the might of this power in the voices of those men, and you know that you're part of something that is more powerful than you. You come really closer to God, realizing that kind of ghostly power that exists, that is able to bring order in chaos, right? In creating this little Rome, after all, that the castrum is everywhere you go. And it's exemplified also by the Roman colony, that is a military colony par excellence, and the oppida that develop are also, in fact, part of the Roman camps, actually.